This lecture is on Chapter 6, Emotion. Did you know that public kissing is frowned upon in Japan? And while in many countries there are laws that prohibit indecent behavior in public, as well as religious standards that prescribe modesty between men and women, in Japan neither actually apply. Japan has no rule or law or religious edict against kissing in public. People simply just follow a tradition, an old and informal rule of conduct. So while kissing is rare in Japan, if you were to visit New York or Moscow, you will inevitably see people hugging or kissing goodbye at the train station or airport. So, what is so unacceptable about public kissing to the Japanese? People from Japan will actually tell you that from the beginning of their lives, they are taught to learn to restrain their emotions in public. So that leads us to what exactly is emotion? Well, it's an evaluative response that typically includes some combination of physiological arousal, subjective experience, positive, negative, or ambivalent, and behavioral expression. There was a large-scale comparative study that was done. It involved 37 different countries, and it revealed that people in both Western and non-Western countries displayed the same general expression patterns with regards to emotions. So generally speaking, men as a group tended to be more prone towards the expression of anger, while women as a group tended to be more prone toward the expression of sadness or fear. So another interesting argument about similarities of emotional experience is that emotion derives from numerous studies about the process of identification, the process of description, an explanation of an emotional expression. So for short, basically emotion recognition. There was another study that was done, and subjects in 5 countries, the United States, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, and Japan, were shown photographs of people, each of whom they displayed one of 6 emotions: happiness, sadness, anger, fear, surprise, or disgust. And most of these subjects correctly identified these emotions. And so what is found is there is an amazing similarity in the way that people name emotions across different cultures and different languages. In other languages, there are equivalent words for virtually every English term for emotions. So regardless of where we live or what language we speak, people can generally tell another person's emotion. And even if we don't speak someone's language, we are usually able to tell whether that person is happy or sad simply by looking at their facial expression. Now, despite the similarities that we tend to see in emotional experiences across cultures, there are differences in the way that people tend to describe their basic emotions. So, for example, some studies have pointed to cultural differences in the degree to which some groups experience positive emotions, such as joy, as well as negative emotions, such as anger. In the Buddhist tradition, the 7 basic emotions are described as happiness, anger, sorrow, joy, love, hate, and desire. And a review of studies on ancient Chinese texts that include philosophies such as Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism found various sets of noted emotions that ranged from 5 to 7, while the English translation has a total of 12 labels of emotion. So at this point, what it leads us to is that cultural groups are going to differ with respect to both the frequency and the significance of common emotional reactions. A Japanese American psychologist surveyed more than 350 college students in Japan, Korea, and the US. What was found was that on average, European Americans reported being happier than Asian Americans, Koreans, or Japanese. However, European Americans also became emotionally distracted by negative events. Think of getting a parking ticket or maybe getting a bad grade. And they recover from these setbacks much more slowly than their counterparts of Asian ancestry. Alternatively, Koreans, Japanese, and to a lesser extent, Asian Americans reported that they are less happy in general, but do recover to their normal emotional state much faster than European Americans. The researchers found that European Americans needed nearly 2 positive events in order to return to their normal level of happiness, whereas the Koreans, the Japanese, and the Asian Americans on average only needed 1 positive event to recover emotionally. In addition, some other differences that have been found is that cultures will vary in the linguistic descriptions of emotion. So the Tahitian language, for example, has 46 different words for anger, but they don't have any word for sadness. In some African languages, the same word can represent both sadness and anger. And in some Russian dialects, the phrase "I pity you" can also indicate "I love you," one's condolences, and even one's contempt. So continuing on with our differences in emotional experience, subjects from various cultures also vary in their degree of agreement concerning specific emotions. So in one study, happiness was correctly identified by 68% of African participants and by 97% of their European counterparts. In another study, US and European groups correctly identified from 75 to 83% of emotions in facial photographs, whereas the Japanese group scored only 65% and the African group only 50%. The recognition rate of facial expressions on photographs was lower when subjects were found to have little previous contact with other cultures. Furthermore, disgust as an emotion is usually associated with cultural requirements in terms of rejecting certain foods or even avoiding particular situations that are related to eating. And disgust is also associated with the perception of food contamination. So there was a study done that was 125 Hindu children and 106 US children, and all of them were between the ages of 4 and 8. And what they showed was that most rejected food that was contaminated by contact with a cockroach, a human hair, or if the juice was tried by a stranger. Indian children, however, were more sensitive than US children to those contaminants. So now that we've looked at similarities and we've looked at differences, are emotions different or are they universal? Well, let's think about pain. Is severe pain after a stumble likely to cause a negative emotion in any 2 individuals? Perhaps. What if one person is born and raised in Puerto Rico and the other comes from Iran? There's no difference. A stumble is going to cause physical pain, and that physical pain in turn will cause some type of negative emotion. So, how we feel and how we express our feelings is based on our personality, our experiences, our immediate circumstances, the presence or absence of other people, and many, many other factors. For example, you may hide frustration after a clumsy fall in a public place, but scream and curse if such a fall were to happen at your home where no one can see you. So emotions can be seen as similar or different because we often perceive, analyze, and think about them from different points of view, regardless of our background or culture. So, as we've kind of talked about, there are a lot of preceding events. There's always something that's going to cause or initiate some specific type of emotion. So, a pain in your body, a lost softball game, a meeting with a person you adore, a windy or rainy day, an annoying flow of music streaming from a satellite radio. Many of these preceding events in our everyday lives bear some particular emotional significance for us. So, what these preceding events are is they are the environmental circumstances and the individual reactions that have a strong impact on particular emotional experiences. So, do people across cultures then concede that the loss of a friend is a sad event and the birth of a child is a happy one? Well, cross-culturally, basic emotions are generally marked or caused by similar types of events. In essentially all studies of cultures, the most important event categories were birth and death, good and bad news, acceptance or rejection in relationships, and meetings with friends. Now, other situations can be interpreted differently across cultures and therefore lead to different emotions. There's also some scientific and anecdotal evidence for cultural differences in emotion eliciting events. So, most Europeans, as well as North and South Americans, are going to consider the number 13 as unlucky. Some are even afraid to live in an apartment number 13 or on the 13th floor. Most of the hotels in the United States don't have a 13th floor. It goes from the 12th floor to the 14th. Now, people of many other ethnic groups, they would pay little attention to this number. It wouldn't mean anything to them. Now, people in Russia, for example, they're afraid to keep an even number of flowers in a vase. And this is because an even number of flowers is what is typically brought to a funeral. So that just shows how these situations can be interpreted differently, and that can lead to different emotions. So, continuing to talk about emotions, we're usually aware of our emotions. We usually know if we feel good or bad, if we're scared, if we're surprised, if we're frustrated, or even if we're relieved at different times. And despite these tremendous individual variations, there are some cultural norms and rules that regulate our evaluations of emotions. And evaluations of emotions is basically our individual assessment of emotions according to certain criteria or principles. So there is evidence out there that people may carry cultural beliefs about which emotions are most significant or most suitable to their particular social roles or social settings. And so what happens is people of different cultures will evaluate words that indicate particular emotions in these different and similar ways. Now, continuing on, we often consider whether laughter, which is usually an expression of joy, or head shaking, an expression of disappointment, might evoke either a positive or a negative reaction from others. And so, what that leads us to is an emotional complexity. Are we expected to feel a certain way in certain situations? So, emotional situations or emotional experiences can certainly be influenced by social norms or even popular expectations. So, what happens here is we have what we call feeling rules. And these are particular cultural rules about how to feel in particular situations. And what this leads us to are these emotional experiences that contradict some basic social norms that could be quite different from these emotions that are in line with the existing customs. Moreover, an emotion can be felt differently considering the context in which it is either displayed or observed. So, looking at emotional complexity or the co-occurrence of both a pleasant and an unpleasant emotion simultaneously has been found to be more prevalent in Eastern cultures than in Western cultures. And that's exactly what we're seeing here in this figure, which is figure 6.1 in your textbook. We're seeing how that happy sad can be viewed as either mutually dependent or a little bit of overlapping in that state of balance. So there is evidence suggesting that individuals will feel more certain about the meaning of events, and they're going to give more certain emotional responses when there are clear norms about how to interpret these events and how to respond to them. So, how do people assess these emotional experiences? Well, when people try to evaluate their emotional experience, they make assessments about that experience, especially about the experience of the emotion, along with the dimensions of pleasure or displeasure, but also along several other dimensions. For example, people tend to try to determine whether their emotions are, one, caused by a familiar or unfamiliar event, two, suggest the existence of an obstacle, three, create some type of sense of being in charge or being out of control, four, increase or decrease the self-esteem, and five, cause praise, reproach, or mockery by one's group. So, what is our expression of emotion? Well, there's rules about emotional expression, and we call them display rules. And they're acquired primarily during the socialization period. And what display rules are is it's going to be patterns of emotional expression that are considered appropriate within a particular culture, age, or social group. And there are at least two criteria for assessing emotional expressions: frequency and intensity. So, for example, in the United States, many parents commonly tend to say, "I love you" to their children, and vice versa. Now, contrarily, in the Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus, such a verbal expression of affection between parents and children and siblings is considered too strong or hyperbolic, and is therefore expressed in only a very few critical life situations. So, what happens when we do research on stress and anxiety and how emotions relate to those? Well, the actual amount of stress and anxiety is difficult to measure. And this is because people have different coping strategies, and they evaluate stress using very dissimilar criteria. The ways that people evaluate stress, as well as the situations that they may consider stressful, are culturally determined, but at the same time, they may also depend on individual traits. Now, stress, this is the realization of a challenge to a person's capacity to adapt to an inner and outer demand. And there are two important aspects of stress. One, it is a psychobiological process. And two, it entails a transaction between people and their environments. So one of the most stressful events that any individual can experience is the death of a family member or a close friend. In addition to extremely stressful events, we have what we call daily hassles. And what daily hassles are is they are where we have the absence of food, a lack of free time, basically any type of sources of stress. Additionally, we have catastrophes and disasters such as earthquakes, floods, violence, and other traumatic events that affect millions of people across the world. So cross-culturally, many survivors of these such traumatic events will continue to experience recurrent nightmares or difficulties in their relationships and may tend to be prone to anxiety and depression. We also have to look at cross-cultural studies of anger. So anger is an emotion that's aroused by one's perception of being interfered with or threatened and or an overt or covert activity of attack or offense. Anger is seen as an interpersonal emotion because its experience usually involves some type of norm violation committed by other people. At the same time, people get angry and they interpret this emotion according to the norms of the culture in which they live. So while anger is universal, how we interpret anger is what is going to be cultural. So, for instance, Japanese cultural traditions, like we stated, strongly inhibit the public display of private emotions, particularly negative ones. So we talked about kissing in Japan, but negative emotions are really supposed to be strongly inhibited. Japanese culture emphasizes homogeneity and conformity as necessary conditions for the maintenance of their society's network of interdependence. So in most collectivist cultures, anger is seen as an emotion of disengagement from society, a threat to its integrity, and therefore is generally discouraged. While individualistic societies, such as the United States, are more open to displays of anger since people's right to independence and self-expression are given greater valence. So lastly, we have to talk about cross-cultural studies of happiness. When we talk about cross-cultural studies of happiness, we have to talk about how cross-cultural psychology critically examines various views of happiness that have existed in different cultures and in different academic traditions for centuries. And I know that it says the 6 views of happiness. There's actually 7. I'm not really sure what happened here, but basically progressive got left off the list. Now, the progressive is included when we look at the little examination of each and every view, but in this little list on the second bullet point, it did get left off. So the 7 views of happiness are materialist, progressive, situational, perception, comparative, expectation, biological, and spiritual. So, according to the materialist view, an individual can become happy through the accumulation of material wealth, such as money. Happiness also involves the possession of power and high social status. So, the higher the social status of an individual, the more power he or she has, and thus more status and power translate into happiness. The progressive view adds an important element to the recipe for happiness, and that is social care. So, supporters of this view argue that if every individual is guaranteed and given basic social services, think of healthcare, affordable housing, decent salary, paid vacations, free tuition, just to name a few, there will be practically no external factors that would then contribute to an individual's unnecessary suffering. So basically, if one's basic needs are secured, the individual ought to be happy. Our situational view maintains that happiness is not necessarily about material or social services, but rather the cumulative life situation in which individuals tend to find themselves determining how happy they are. The perception comparative view suggests that happiness is a state of mind that's based on appraisals and comparisons. So an individual who is doing better than others will tend to feel better about life. The expectation view, so view number 5, refers to the goals that the individual had in the past and then the degree to which a person has accomplished these goals. And then finally, the last two views are the biological view, which suggests that whether people are happy or less happy primarily is going to depend on their genetic or biological makeup. So the brain and the body are going to be mainly responsible for pleasant sensations, and some people are just going to be predisposed to have more of such sensation than others. And finally, the spiritual view. This is going to underline the importance of inner factors, and it's going to emphasize the search for the higher power within the individual. So philosophers, religious scholars, pundits, social sciences, in many cultures and religions and regions have discussed the ephemeral nature of our sensations and our emotions. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Please reach out if you have any questions.